A book review of Ornament and Crime by Adolphe Loos. I should start by saying that Ornament and Crime was first presented as the title of a lecture in 1910 by the Viennese interior designer, architect, and most notably critic, Adolphe Loos. The lecture subsequently was published as a standalone essay. Nevertheless, easily recognizable as a consistent theme in Loos' writing, Ornament and Crime, by extension, refers to a collection of his essays spanning a period of over 30 years. Loos's writings are clearly polemical, positively hyperbolic in their criticisms, particularly of architecture, the decorative and applied arts. As an early member of the Vienna Secession, a group of artists and architects who broke away from the established and conservative Vienna Künstlerhaus, his affiliation was not to endure long. Adolphe seceded from the secession, pursuing an initially very individual course in search of the modern aesthetic. The impact of his writings cannot be understated. At a time of utter confusion in the arts, in the face of industrial ascendance, entropy of culture and loss of traditions, Loos was articulating a crystal-clear message, what at the time must have seemed to be some sort of potential way out, if not a way forward. Despite the fact that I disagree entirely with many of his conclusions, I find myself obligated to concur with many of his observations. Adolphe Loos was not a ninny. If one cares to understand how and why the state of art and architecture are as they are today, being so distinctly different from what came before, why traditional craft lies in such an impoverished condition, then I might suggest reading his essays as a point of departure. Advocacy for the handwerker, criticism for the architect. It comes as a surprise to many that Adolphe Loos apprenticed in the family business as a stonemason and carver. Although he began studies both in engineering and architecture, he never completed them, opting instead to travel abroad to America, where he supported himself, among other things, as a brick mason, for which he received a certificate. His support for the independence of the handicraftsman, particularly from the academies of art and architecture, is a central theme in his writings, a position that never wavered. Adolphe notes that a century earlier to his time, Vienna and Austria had a style, both organic and traditional. One bought shoes from the cobbler, trousers from the tailor, rooms from the cabinet maker. No one was telling the varied craftsman what to do, yet everything was well made and matched just fine. Nevertheless, over the course of the 19th century, profound minds immersed themselves in another age and found happiness as an ancient Greek, a medieval symbolist, or a Renaissance man. The craftsman was pressed into service, forced to abandon his long cultivated traditions, to adopt all at once the pinnacles of artistic achievements of classical Greece and Rome, Romanesque and Gothic, Moorish and the Baroque. In fact, everything that had been made throughout history in all nations, and produced new inventions as well. The traditional craftsman lacked the scholarly proficiency of an aesthetic polyglot, the academic archaeologist who exposed him as naive, provincial, and stupid. So everything of value save his back was wrested from the materialistic craftsman, now placed under the alien authority of the man of ideas, forms, books, and drawing, the architect who learned draftsmanship, and since that is all he has learnt, he is good at it. The craftsman is not. The architect has reduced the noble art of building to a graphic art. The one who receives the most commissions is not the one who can build best, but the one whose work looks best on paper. There is a world of difference between the two. Interestingly, he took specific aim at Otto Wagner, the most accomplished architect of Vienna, who fit this description to a T. He accused Wagner of designing every minute detail of his projects, leaving no contribution for the craftsman, even whilst confessing that due to Wagner's virtuoso ability, he manages to pull it off. Genius acknowledged, Loos made his stand against architecture that draws attention to itself as a testament of singular artistic ability. Loos was less impressed by the aesthetic accomplishment of Wagner's work, as much as he was disconcerted by the trend he represented, the approach to architecture as a fine art, especially considering Otto Wagner's position as professor of architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Loos called for an end to the academic abomination, for revolution. It is high time our craftsworkers tried to throw off this uncalled-for tutelage and started to rely on their own good sense. Anyone who wants to collaborate is welcome. All credit to anyone who is willing to don an apron and take his place at the humming potter's wheel, or strip to the waist and help at the furnace. But those dilettantes who want to dictate their designs to the creative artists from the comfort of their studios should stick to their own field, namely graphic art. If you want craftsmen in touch with the style of the times, poison the architects. I've yet to try that last suggestion. The pogrom against ornament. The multi-pronged attacks on ornament lack the coherence of some of his other arguments, but were the ones to be most revered by the coming modernist movement. He repeatedly makes a point that is largely verifiable. There was far more ornament applied to everyday items in architecture in the 19th century than at any previous point in Viennese and European culture more generally. 1800s Europe was dripping ears to arse in ornament, much of it shoddily conceived, near all of it culturally foreign. Some of the appetite for ornament he attributes to the presentation of archaeological discoveries, as well as artifacts of the aristocracy to the public, particularly under interpretive curation at museums. Out of the tremendous cash collected, what was selected for display was typically the most enriched, bejeweled of items. Loos attributes their survival to being preserved as art objects, ceremonial showcases of ostentation and power. Utilizing them as models for practical use, therefore, would be to miss the original intention completely. Unless, of course, the intention was to emulate the aristocracy or nobility of former times, an envious pathology that seemed to have infected the upwardly mobile bourgeoisie. He thus describes a life lived amongst hallowed relics. The lives we lead are at variance with the objects with which we surround ourselves. We forget we need a living room as well as a throne room, and we are quite happy to let ourselves be physically abused by these pieces of furniture in antique styles. We bash our knees and etch complete ornaments into our backs. Our bowls, jugs, and vases has given us in turn Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo calluses on our hands. Basically, the argument was that the bourgeoisie was not attracted to ornamentation because of their cultivated taste, nor because it gave them any pleasure whatsoever. Rather, it was that they thought by having it, others would think they had taste. Being a purely instrumental, shallow desire, there was no qualms about selecting a cheap fake, which only served to degrade craft further. By contrast, Loos advocates for domestic architecture that the rooms of a house should have the mark of the owner and be comfortable for the family, also cultivating and reflecting their true taste, for good or ill. The one concession he makes to the aforementioned approach is perhaps for the parlor, or a similar room for receiving guests, where a specific outward presentation might be desired, upon which he cautions, "Rest assured that everyone will find the designer he deserves." Having fully imbibed the Hegelian nectar of the inexorable progress of civilization, Loos strikes out into far more questionable territory, claiming that the less advanced nation, the more extravagant its ornament. He offers no justification for his argument, instead providing the highly ornamented Paupins and the highly ornamenting Red Indians as examples of the primitive and culturally poor, contrasted with the pragmatic, restrained, eminently civilized English, the culturally rich who are lavishly praised as guardians of the true Germanic spirit. Although quite natural for the primitive Paupin or Indian to tattoo themselves or adorn their canoes, he argues that a person of our times who gives way to the urge to daub the walls with erotic symbols is a criminal or degenerate. He urges the Viennese to thus overcome the Red Indian within themselves and emulate the English. Racism aside, I have to question whether or not Adolphe was simply completely unaware of what William Morris and the arts and crafts movement was really up to in England. This line of argument equating appreciation of ornament with ignorance and dirtiness, unfit for the clean, modern man, has stuck. It's been very damaging to architecture, culture, and inadvertently yet undeniably damaging to traditional handcraft. Although there is some recovery, the aesthetic cleansing sprung from his polemic has yet a long way from being fully extricated. Not to end on a sour note, I have to say there is much more to recommend of Adolphe Loos's essays than that last bit of nonsense above, such as his genuine concern for the physical and psychological working conditions of craftsmen, and advocacy for the respect as well as equal treatment and rights for women. Finally, his additional essay, simply entitled Architecture, is one of the best expositions I've read on how architecture ought to relate to the landscape, natural and urban, and how architecture is not an art. In the spirit of keeping your friends close and your enemies even closer, I recommend Adolphe Loos's collected essays, Ornament and Crime, as an important reading for the contemporary craftsman.